Hello! Welcome back to Brenda's Books. Today we are on Chapter 30 of Queen Andraya. Thank you so much for coming back to listen to more. Here we go. Chapter 30, To the Core. The queen straightened her posture and spoke matter-of-factly. Maurice, Bopsy, please. My marriage was arranged. I had no choice in the matter. I could not have fathomed what a wretched man Gordon would turn out to be. Out of the corner of her eye, the queen noticed Steffan's shocked face. If the late King Gordon was indeed in partnership with King Zokai to take on slavery, this is the first I have heard of it. Maurice pointed a finger at her. I think you knew about their plans, but did nothing. Wrong, the queen snapped. I would never venture in such a gross atrocity. And I will not have you accuse me of it any further. The queen stood abruptly, screeching her wooden chair across the floor. Benjamin and the prince stood too, but the Sandrian couple remained still, looking dumbfounded. I came to Sandrian to rescue my best friend from slavery, and now I am going to find her. And with that, the queen lifted her skirt and marched to the front door with her head held high. My lady, please wait, the prince called. Andraya whirled around. For what? More judgment and criticism from these people? I have had enough, she said sternly. They do not understand how royals live, Steffan explained. In their culture, spouses share everything. A strange surge of jealousy seeped through the queen's chest. She inhaled a large breath. Even still, I believe I have overstayed my welcome. She turned again, but the prince grabbed her wrist. On instinct, she yanked her arm away. Gordon had done the same thing far too many times. But instead of rage on Steffan's face like she expected, she only saw hurt. This caught her completely off guard, and her anger dissipated. I am sorry, she whispered. Maurice spoke rapidly in Sandrian to the prince. Steffan did not take his eyes off Andraya as he answered him. The tall Sandrian man walked over to them and said, Queen Andraya, if Prince Steffan says you had nothing to do with your husband's actions, then we will believe him. Andraya turned to face Maurice. His tan, wrinkled face appeared soft and sincere. And Bopsy says she is sorry for throwing the ring at you. The queen glanced over at Bopsy's tiny self. She was wringing her hands, looking ashamed and slightly frightened. Andraya released the breath she had been holding. All is well, thank you, Maurice. He nodded and his tone lowered. Do you think your friend has ended up with the slaves? The queen managed a nod. I will take you to them in the morning, Maurice promised, at first light. Andraya peered out the miniature window of the cottage, with its faded red drapes pulled open. The sun hung low on the horizon, allowing its last stream of light to enter the room. Bopsy straightened her gray hemp skirt and walked over to them in earnest, speaking excitedly in Sandrian. Steffan smiled and nodded. They have invited us to stay the night, he translated. That is very kind of you, said the queen. Yes, thank you, Benjamin chimed in. Bopsy looked at Hudson for a response, but his large stature and silent response only caused her to step back again. We have 2 beds in the other room, said Maurice. I think we should let the womenfolk have those. Absolutely, Steffan agreed with a nod. The queen stifled a gasp. 2 beds, she thought. But where will the rest of you sleep? She asked. We have plenty of space here on the floor, Maurice mollified. He motioned with his arm from one side of the room to the other, as if they occupied some grand hall. Andraya stared down at the faded blue rug beneath them, which was so thin and worn down she doubted it would give them any padding at all. Maurice laughed. If we came to visit your palace, we would all probably have our own rooms and our own servant. Yes? Andraya did not know how to answer that. Maurice just grinned. Do not worry, Queen Andraya. He pointed to Steffan. This man proved to me long ago that the wealthy can be good people too. Steffan responded with a small, modest smile. Do you know if the Sandrian royal family is all right, Maurice? Asked the queen. Maurice frowned and shook his head. We think they all died in the palace fire, but others believe some escaped and went into hiding. Who is governing the city then? Andraya asked. Maurice cringed. It would seem the merchants are in control, he said, with a slight malice in his tone. Maurice continued to tell them what little he knew about the obvious arson attack on the palace, while Bobsy did her best to make their night's stay comfortable. She put a fresh pillow on Andraya's bed and set out 4 others on the floor for the men, along with 4 woolen blankets. Benjamin and Hudson lay down and fell asleep almost immediately, and Maurice and Bobsy went into the kitchen to wash some dishes. Andraya sat in a chair by the fire and watched it crackle and spark. The prince plopped into a seat next to her. They sat in silence for a long moment. Then Steffan placed a gentle hand on her knee. How are you, my love? Andraya turned her head to look at him. His blue eyes shone bright in the firelight. She rested a hand on top of his. Other than being worried sick over Colleen, I am fine. Steffan stared down at their pile of fingers and grew silent. I am sorry you must sleep on the floor, Andraya whispered. Steffan flashed her a smile. I have slept in worse conditions. Oh, that is right. My very own palace dungeon. How deplorable. Steffan's grin brightened. I was not referring to that, actually. Andraya gave him a quizzical stare. Then what were you referring to? His grin faltered, looking as if he wanted to take back his words. The queen raised her eyebrows when he said nothing. Steffan leaned back in his chair. I do not believe it is a story you will want to hear. It has something to do with your travels to Gulin, does it not? Andraya guessed. Yes, Steffan said simply. How long were you there for? 2 years. Really? The queen said with wide eyes. Then how is it that Ghoulish is the only island language you do not speak? Well, I did pick up on some of it, but I was a child, and I had no opportunity for learning while I was there. Why were you there? Steffan inhaled a deep breath and leaned forward, resting his forearms on his thighs. If I tell you this, will you tell me the secret you still have not shared with me? Andraya hesitated. Not yet. Steffan chuckled and hung his head. All right then, he said, glancing back up at her. Will you tell me about King Gordon? Andraya wanted to laugh, since King Gordon and her secret were one and the same. But she could not laugh. Nothing about Gordon was funny. What about him? Steffan shrugged. What was he like? Andraya hefted a breath. He wanted to help King Zokai with slavery. Does that not speak volumes about his character? Steffan lifted his eyebrows up and down. I suppose, but I do not want to talk about him, Steffan, the queen interrupted. Steffan stared at her as if he were trying to solve a puzzle. He interlocked his fingers with hers and took a deep breath. He lowered his voice to almost a whisper. You know, sometimes I envy the commoner. He pointed his head toward Maurice and Bobsy. Andraya glanced over at the couple. They were embracing one another. Bobsy, who barely reached Maurice's chest, smiled up at her husband. Maurice smoothed his wife's hair and kissed her forehead. They have next to nothing, and their kingdom is falling apart. And look how happy they are, Steffan said. Are you not happy? Andraya asked. Oh, no, I am, he clarified. But I want to share everything with the one I love. And you already know that person is you. Andraya inhaled a shaky breath. Those brilliant blue eyes of his were boring into her again. Then how about you share your visit to Gulin with me? Steffan's expression grew wary. He studied her countenance for a long moment, as if he were contemplating something. Then he bowed his head and cleared his throat. He switched his language to Medianese, and his voice came out low and raspy. I was a slave. What? Andraya shrieked. Maurice and Bobsy turned their heads to look at them. Hudson woke with a start and jumped to his feet. He scanned the room with suspicious, guarded eyes. What is it, my queen? Oh, Hudson, I am so sorry I woke you. The prince only surprised me, that is all, said Andraya. Hudson glared at the prince. How? Steffan cocked his head, giving him a disapproving look as if Hudson had just accused him of something dreadful. Benjamin also awoke. He sat up, propping his arms on his knees. Is everything all right, Your Majesty? Yes, yes, of course, Andraya said with slight irritation. I am sorry I woke you. Please, try to go back to sleep. Benjamin slowly lay back down, but Hudson moved a few feet away and reclaimed his familiar statuesque position. Hudson, you may sleep as well, said the Queen. I am not tired, he declared, even though his blinking bloodshot eyes proved otherwise. Andraya sighed, deciding to leave him be. She turned back to the prince and spoke softly in Medianese. How on earth did that happen? Steffan inhaled a deep breath and responded in Medianese as well. My eldest brother was 16 at the time and was a very charismatic abolitionist. He convinced my parents to allow him to travel to Gulen to share his views. I was only 5 years old, but still very interested in what he was doing, so they allowed me to tag along. Andraya's mouth dropped. Did they not know how dangerous that would be? Steffan grimaced. They were not part of the island coalition, and they had only ever lived in Deldria, where basic laws of civility and cordiality are the norm, so they were completely naive as to what other kingdoms were like. What was it like? What happened? Andraya whispered. Steffan blanched, and his palms grew clammy against hers. Well, once the street people heard what my brother had to say, they took both of us out to one of the sugarcane fields and... Steffan paused and bit his lip hard. His face contorted from anger to shame to sorrow to rage, all within a few moments. And they forced us to work. We got 10 lashings if we stopped. Of course, I was young and could not carry the required water in bushels. So my brother... He paused again and looked away when his eyes grew wet. My brother did most of it for me, but it was difficult for him, so he... Steffan clasped a hand over his mouth and grimaced when his tears spilled over. So he suffered a lot. Silence stifled the room. Andraya rubbed her hand over his. She rubbed his knee and his shoulder and his neck, while the prince remained in the same position, with his elbow resting on the armchair and his hand over his mouth. After several long minutes, Andraya asked, How did you get out? Steffan finally slid his hand down his face and onto his lap. My parents eventually found us, and let's just say they paid a large sum of money to get us back. Andraya blew out a gush of air. Steffan lifted a hand to her cheek and wiped off something wet. I am sorry to make you cry. The Queen had not realized she had been crying. You know, Gordon treated me similarly, although instead of a whip he used his fist. Steffan's eyes bulged. He did not. Andraya nodded. I know the two cannot be compared, but he was your husband, Steffan cut in. How could he? Then he brushed his gentle fingers from her forehead down her cheek. Oh, darling, I am so sorry. You do not need to be sorry, she whispered. Then suddenly he was kissing her softly, but earnestly, all over her face and lips too. Then he pulled her onto his lap and held her close. Andraya rested her head against his chest and listened to his heartbeat. It was in that quiet moment that she realized something. Steffan would not turn into Gordon. He was not capable of it. He would remain his kind, perceptive, uncontrolling self. And with each deep breath Steffan took, the deeper this truth filled her to the core. And that concludes chapter 30. Whew, that's a hard one to get through. But I hope you liked it, and I hope you come back next week for more of Queen Andraya. And as always, if you want to find out more about Brenda's books, you can visit brendasbooks.net. Until next time, take care.